Okay, I see folks are coming in. We're going to wait just a little bit as they start coming in. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I just realized it's the first we've done in 2021, so we're excited to have people that are returning as webinar attendees and some new folks if you're on the line. Just to give you a couple of logistics, we are going to record this. I'm going to repeat these logistics a little bit later too, but just so you know, we are recording this, and we are going to have a Q&A at the end of Keith's presentation. So before we jump into Keith's presentation, again, I want to welcome you, and I want to let you know that today's webinar is sponsored by both Comtech and CIDM. If you're not familiar, those two entities are one and the same. Comtech is our consulting firm, and we have been doing business since 1978, providing help to our clients in everything that it has to do with creating excellent content and making your customers have a better experience with your content. So everything from content strategy, information modeling, whether that's for DITA or non-DITA, taxonomy development so your clients can find your content easier, process maturity so you can see how well your organization compares to other organizations, and of course DITA implementation, everything from style sheets to constraints. We also do user studies so you can see what your users think of your content, and we do benchmark studies so you can see how you compare to your competitors. So we do a little bit of everything. In everything that we do on the consulting side, we have a series of training classes that you can take. Right now, those classes are all online, and hopefully by the end of the year, or certainly in 2022, we'll go back to doing a hybrid of online and in-person classes. So that's on the Comtech side, that's the services side. On the CIDM side, that's a member organization that was actually started almost when Comtech started, not quite. And it was started because our clients asked us for a way for them to communicate with other managers. STC has been around for a long time, but that was mostly writers. The managers wanted a way to deal with management content. And then from that, we started putting on conferences, doing webinars like this, and then that are open to the public. Conferences and webinars are open to the public, but then we have some members only activities like monthly roundtable discussions that we host. They also have their own Slack channel, and they get managers best practices newsletter as well. So if you're interested in becoming a member or doing any services or taking our training, you can visit our two websites. So just to give you a couple heads up, we do have some online classes coming up. A couple of them, if we have any folks that are from Asia, we have two classes that are going to be going on during your prime time. So 9 o'clock in the Asian time zone, so a little bit nicer for you guys, so you're not having to stay up really late to take the classes. And then, of course, we have other classes happening in normal business hours for most of the US and Europe as well. So check those out on the Comtech training site. We currently don't have an Agile class going on. I expect most of you are on the call because you're interested in Agile processes. We do have one. So if your team wants to take one, Comtech can certainly do a customized class for your organization. If you head to the Comtech website, you certainly can see details about that Agile class that we teach, specifically for technical communications as opposed to software development. On the conference side, we have our big annual conference coming up. This is Convex. This is the second year we're hosting this. This is for all content creators, whether you're part of training, marketing, our traditional tech comms folks, user experience. We've got topics on all of those areas for everybody. And if you register before St. Patrick's Day and use the coupon code Lucky Day, you can get an extra $100 off. And that only applies to non-members. The members already get a nice discounted rate or even free tickets. So that's upcoming conferences. And by the way, Keith is speaking at Convex this year. So if you're liking what you're hearing, then certainly you want to join, as well as several people from his organization at Precision Content there. So check out that conference agenda. It's up on the website now. We also have lots of webinars scheduled. We have quite a few more than the 2 that I've listed here for March. And then we actually have a couple more going up in April. We just haven't posted them yet. So you can certainly visit the CIDM website to get a look at those upcoming webinars. And if you want to stay informed, if you're not already on our mailing list, we encourage you to join our mailing list so you can get emails about these free webinars, about our upcoming training, upcoming conferences, and get our newsletter as well, our free newsletter as well. You could also follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter. So that's enough commercials. I'm going to turn it over to Keith here so he can speak, just to let you know a little bit more about the logistics. Keith is going to talk between almost an hour, not quite, and then he'll be around until the half hour, so that plenty of time for questions. So use the questions dialogue to ask questions, and you can also no, there's not a chat. There's just the Q&A right now. So use the Q&A. And like I said, we are going to record it. So with that, Keith, I'm turning it over to you.
Woohoo! All right. So let's see. And I have to share my screen. And let me okay, so just bear with me a moment while we sort out the logistics here. And let's see, share my screen. And with any luck, and again, hopefully you're seeing my full screen rather than my notes and such.
We are. So
Excellent.
you're set to go.
All right. All right. Well, hey, hello everybody. Nice to still be delivering hey the very first webinar of the year for CIDM. That's an added bonus for me, which is it's actually kind of nice. And the topic for today, as you can see, is as I say here, looking beyond Agile, looking at the idea of structured content development and using the iterative and incremental development methodology. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking a fair bit about the studies and research that I've done on Agile processes in general, and then how they are applied to documentation. And then I'll be having a look at the iterative and incremental development methodology near the end. So, and the idea is that it's not necessarily, despite the title, it's not necessarily here to replace Agile. IID is really still under the sort of Agile umbrella. It is simply another possible flavor, and one that we appears as though it may be better suited for some software development projects that also have documentation portion added to them. So anyways, but I'll get to that. Here is the agenda. Hang on, here we go. Yes, there we go. So basically, the sort of standard introduction, then I'll have a look at the business reasons for using Agile within tech docs. And then I'll look at some of the reasons why DITA tends to work so well with Agile. And then I'll be looking at doing an introduction to the iterative and incremental development methodology, IID for short. And then last but not least, questions at the very end. And by the way, I'm also assuming that the audience has at least a basic familiarity with Agile in general. So I won't be explaining things like, what Scrum is or what Kanban is, for example, though I will, of course, be talking about the iterative and incremental development Agile methodology in more detail. But I'm assuming that the people who are here at this presentation already have at least some basic knowledge of Agile methodologies and terminologies. if you're wondering who this guy is and why what I do, my name is Keith Shangri-Roberts, and I am a senior content strategist with Precision Content. I'm also their liaison with Oasis and the chair of the DITA Adoption Committee, and also a member of the DITA Technical Committee that is working on the next DITA standard, DITA 2.0. And I'm also a member of the Lightweight DITA subcommittee, though sadly I haven't been able to attend meetings for a while. I feel kind of bad about that, but I am keeping on top of what they're doing these days, and it's very cool stuff. I'm also, as I say here, an occasional professor. Usually I teach the summer course for master students on information architecture at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. And I had to check how many years I've been working with DITA. It's definitely 14 plus years, possibly around 15. But wow, yeah. And I like to say that that's part of the reason why I have so much gray hair at the moment. But anyways, some of you out there may also know me as DITA Writer. This is an industry blog I started just over 10 years ago, and it has just shy of 400,000 views, which isn't bad for a niche website when you think about it. It really does focus on data for technical writers and managers and information architects, and that's kind of an obscure subject. So to get that many hits over that amount of time kind of says that I'm probably doing something right. Uh, if you're not familiar with the site, it has regularly updated information on things like DITA conferences, books on DITA, companies that are using DITA. In fact, that has been updated quite recently. DITA CCMSs that exist, DITA editors, other DITA tools, and also DITA consulting firms. There's also news and views on DITA use, and I try to feature interviews with those who are making a difference in the world of DITA. Now, there's some things that people may not actually know about me if you've seen me in my talks in previous webinars, is that I've always had an interest in management studies, and I actually have a master's in public administration, not an MBA but an MPA, but a lot of the coursework is very similar. And and I've been exposed to a lot of management trends over the years. That's actually another reason why I've got lots of gray hairs, and have taught lean techniques in my information architecture course. I'm also particularly interested in effective management of documentation groups, and so saying since 2015. On and off, I've been interviewing various tech writers and managers about their agile and DITA experiences. So that is where the bulk of this presentation is coming from the material that I've found over the years, and I'm also hoping that after this presentation, I definitely would like to hear more about if you're currently working with structured content like DITA within Agile. I would love to hear more about your own experiences so I can again talk about this the next time I do a presentation on Agile and say DITA. All right, so now let's get on to the business reasons for using Agile within technical documentation. So let's start with kind of the bad old days, so to speak, looking at the idea of waterfall management and technical writing. So the waterfall model also really began in the software development realm and was described in detail back in the 1970s. It essentially has a sequential design process, starting with a basic analysis and then ending with maintenance. So what you can actually see the layout of things here. Basically, you have requirements and analysis done up front, then you do the design for it, and then only after the design is done, you do the coding. And then once the coding is all done, then you do testing, and then once that is all done and presumably published, then you have the maintenance cycle that then follows that. And any technical writing then typically falls between the coding and testing phases, well after the requirement and design phases. And in a way, it can almost be summed up as, basically just documents what's there, or, what will hopefully will be there. I think anybody who has worked in documentation and software has run into certainly the latter circumstance at one time or another. And the majority of documentation teams, I find, still follow this model. And there's, not necessarily anything wrong with that. In some circumstances, this, in fact, can still work out well. And just as a sort of a little cameo there, there's a picture of a young me without the gray hair back in the mid 1990s, definitely in a pre-agile and very much waterfall development process when I was a tech writer at Delrina. I don't know if anybody remembers them. They made fax software. Yes, this is before the days that email and say text messages really took over. And back in those days, we published essentially books of documentation, published books, which were essentially the bulk of the software product, along with the then floppy disks that came with the content. And yeah, basically, we were given the document, we were given the finished software, and told, oh yeah, you guys have to now write this. And by the way, the product launches in a month, or whatever the time frame was. So yeah, I mean, and it's no wonder that things got missed in that particular scenario. So for part of these reasons, this is why agile has really come to the fore, especially in the software realm, and we'll talk more about that later. Some of the problems, however, with waterfall-based management is that they were quite often prone to failure. Now, this is not necessarily to say that the documentation was prone to failure. But hopefully, the documentation was really good. But as I just said, there could be restrictions and issues in terms of time pressures. But from a it's kind of more serious standpoint, is that what if the software itself didn't actually work? Um, Back in 1995, there's actually a kind of like a famous study. The American Department of Defense found that of the 35.7 billion, and yes, that's with a B, spent by the organization on software, only 2% of that was usable as delivered, and that 75% was either never used or was canceled prior to delivery. So one of the things that has been identified is that waterfall really does not deal with changing and adapting to customer needs in a graceful manner, because if I just go back to this, what you might come up with the requirements and analysis and the design, you might find that by the time you actually deliver the product, the software, that in fact the things have changed, because it takes time to do the coding and do the work. And if it takes a year or two or more, is it any surprise that the customer who's expecting this code will have undoubtedly moved on, and requirements and will have changed, but the design has not. So that is a key reason. I mean, that's why this poor man is clearly having a bad day. Okay, well, it's a stock photo, but you get the idea. So this is where the idea of agile really comes to the fore. So back in the winter of 2001, 17 software developers got together at a remote ski resort to talk about the common issues that they faced with traditional development practices. They then published the Agile Manifesto, which is still, by the way, available today at agilemanifesto.org. And that focused on uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. All of the various flavors of Agile, such as Lean, Scrum, Kanban, plus the iterative and incremental development methodology I'll be talking about later, are all ultimately derived from the common principles laid out in the original manifesto, each providing their own take on how to create software more efficiently than waterfall. So you can see the key statements that came out of this here. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value in terms on the right, we see the items on the left as essentially being more as having more value. And this is clearly a difference from the traditional waterfall approach to documentations. Now, I do want to point out, like that one thing that with the second point there about working software over comprehensive documentation. So One of the key things that's often overlooked with that particular statement is that it does not say working software over any documentation, but instead over comprehensive documentation. So it's saying, not it's not saying to dispense with documentation altogether, a point which is sometimes conveniently forgotten about by development staff. That I've certainly run into that in the past, and I have to remind them that that is in fact not what that statement is trying to say. So, you know, there should be at least some documentation, but and it should be useful and functional, but that's not to say it has to cover absolutely everything, and that's really what we're talking about here. And in fact that sort of is one of the key things that is talks about how useful data can be in this particular case, because we're focusing squarely on the user's needs and what they're actually wanting and needing at a particular point in time, in terms of the material that they want, when and where they need it, rather than trying to be wholly comprehensive on how all of this works. All right. So agile, so in terms of agile implications for documentation processes. So again, now this has been my experience in terms of what I have seen in talking to people who do work within this type of framework. Content creators, the technical writers, have to work more closely with the developers. The documentation may support broader communication, such as between teams, customer, the audit process, etc. In other words, documentation may find that it has more than one role. It's not just the documentation of the product, but is also a chance for early feedback on how things are going. Can also be kind of a glue between different groups that may be it's like, well, the product says this, but the documentation says that. It's like, yeah, well, this is actually how it works. That's important. It provides, as I say, early and critical feedback to the development staff. The other thing is that work cycles are faster, and feedback, as I've just pretty much outlined, feedback is definitely more critical. And efficient documentation tools make things much easier. So this really comes down to single sourcing, structured content such as using DITA XML, and of course using things like a component content management system, a CCMS. So what Agile means in practice for tech doc writers is that you tend to work more closely with developers than you would if you're using a waterfall process. So the tech writer assigned to work with one or more development teams, they do then regular reports on their progress. So if you're using Scrum, if you're using a Scrum-based process, there's an expectation that perhaps the lead tech writer, or perhaps all of the tech writers, will attend the stand-up meetings and talk about their progress. Having said, if you're working within a Kanban framework, then the writers are talking about what are their priorities in terms of the material that they are documenting first. They also provide the early feedback on the actual product through active use of the actual product. The tech writers often become the advocates for the users, and they help define realistic user stories. And again, consider if this was a waterfall process, the writers would get essentially a finished product, supposedly, and then they'd have to do all of the documentation all at once. In this case, things are being delivered incrementally, and while maybe not everything is necessarily there and up and working, at least the writers have a sense as to how things ought to go and can document accordingly. And of course, there's also constant changes / iterations of content. So there's more of an emphasis on incremental releases and a change of focus from document everything with waterfall to document only what the user needs, which again is really a key thing for the key advantage about writing with structured content like DITA. And having said that, there's really more than just these 3 points, of course, but these are the changes that are common to almost every tech doc group that I've encountered that are working with Agile and DITA. So, and I've said this before, I've been interviewing tech doc members at various companies who said that they were Agile. Now, the interesting thing is that when I ask them about their processes, they are more often, in fact, largely waterfall based, or do not want to be perceived as not being agile, whatever that is, or well, the rest of the company is agile, so we must be too. So what I like to call agile by osmosis, or they are, we're transitioning to some flavor of agile. So um, and again, I think this in part is due to not to the technical writers or necessarily their managers, but often because of the software teams that are adopting an agile process do not always do, let's say, the best job of commuting how they ought to work with things like documentation teams. So having said that, I found that pseudo agile doc teams to be surprisingly common, and in some ways could even be the norm. However, all agreed that DITA made their jobs easier. And it's worth pointing out here, and again, this is me putting on my, my business hat, business analyst hat, is that Agile really isn't for every business environment. Agile really thrives in environments where short release cycles are possible. This appeared so it's pretty rare to find Agile, at least in the interviews I've done, in highly regulated environments, or with things like, say, heavy machinery, for example. I found one case of Agile being used in pharmaceuticals, but only after their software division had successfully adopted it. I've also found instances of Agile and DITA in the medical device sector, the heavy machinery sector, but in those cases, it was by the software divisions within those firms. So in environments where business factors are pushing for rapid change in product development, agile methodologies are more likely to be introduced. So turning that argument around for a moment, typically if you are in a highly regulated environment, like say a pharmaceutical industry, generally speaking, the development is, it is defined at the beginning what the goals are, and at the end the development is kind of what it is. It's I don't want to say that it can't be used, because there's certainly there wasn't certainly one firm that was in fact using it, but it definitely lends itself well to areas that are using software, and that in turn need documentation in that area. So where Agile really thrives is, as I say here, in general, software is what is known as in the shaping quadrant of industry types, where the environment is unpredictable, but where expectations of customers can be in fact modified or shaped. And what you're seeing in this illustration on the left hand side, by the way, this is derived from a terrific book called Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. I love the title. I'll talk more about that in a second. But they identify, in terms of business processes, the four sort of quadrants you see on the left hand side, and they say that they find that the shaping portion is what they often see being applied to for software development. Now, that's not to say the other forms don't also get a look in. They certainly do in some cases, but more often than not, it's really the shaping quadrant that most typically defines how software development is done. So the rapid testing of releasable products helps shape the market/users' expectations, as the agile approach really makes this possible. So you need an equally agile way to manage documentation. Now, I want to talk for a moment about the book, just because I think it's an excellent excellent review of management literature since the middle of the last century. And basically, what Your Strategy Needs a Strategy does is that it applies what works in terms of management literature for specific business situations. So if you've ever wondered why there's so many books on different books on management, and why there's so many different types of management practices, It's arguably because they've evolved from different environments, and some business approaches to management and process strategy are better fits than others. That's what this book talks about. And for me, that actually provides a nice idea as to how Agile, best fits within software development practices, and also with data management as well, data management of tech docs. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the DITA aspect of things, the evolution of DITA within technical writing. And DITA is, arguably the natural evolution of the need for many writers to work and reuse content more efficiently. And similarly, Agile can be seen as meeting the need of fast-moving department teams to meet the needs of their customers. So the two methodologies complement each other when things are done correctly. Now, I also want to point out that if you're interested in digging up more information on what is considered an ISO standard for Agile documentation, yes, this does exist. So it's ISO 26515:2018, and it's an ISO standard describing how to develop user documentation in an Agile environment. It, as they say here, provides guidance on processes appropriate for information developers, of information for users in software and systems projects that are using Agile development projects. It's nice in that it doesn't prescribe which form or flavor of Agile to use. It basically says, whatever you're using, here are essentially best practices on how you can, achieve documentation goals within Agile in general. And it really neatly outlines everything you need to know about Agile and documentation. The most recent version of this is actually quite recent, from 2018. One minor downside of this, and this is really not for an individual tech writer to buy, but hopefully for their team. The downside is that you have to buy a copy of it, which costs currently 118 Swiss francs, which translates at the moment to roughly $130 US. Okay. The other cool things that again I've noticed in my researches is that there are some interesting similarities between Agile and DITA sectors. So on the left, you see this is some material that I've derived from the DITA Writer website, and this actually looks at a count of and classification of 757 different firms that are known to be using DITA. And you can see that the primary ones are computer software sector, the information technology and services sector, and then after that you come with telecom, semiconductor, medical devices, financial, and so on and so forth. It's not a huge surprise then for me that certainly the technology and sector is a primary Agile user on the right hand side, but it's interesting to see where else it's used. It's also used within the financial services sector to a larger extent than we actually see on the DITA side of things, and then followed by professional services. So in some ways they're kind of flipped around there. But again, it's interesting to see that there is definitely some sort of like if you're a fairly large software company that is using DITA, it's more likely that you're also working within an Agile framework, and vice versa. Now, of course, that's not always going to be the case, but it's more often the case. And I do find this correspondence interesting because I think it bolsters my argument that Agile and DITA tend to work well together in the same business environments. And by the way, the information there on the right-hand side, that's from version 1's 14th annual State of Agile report that was released last year. So that is the most current information on the sectors that are currently using Agile. And by the way, it's a free report. Lots of interesting information as to which forms of Agile are being used and in what manner. So if you're looking for information on how Agile is used in practice, hey, it's definitely good and well worth looking at. Another cool thing here is that DITA is clearly popular among Agile teams, as I've basically already hinted at. It's the most popular form of structured content used by Agile team, and this information sadly, it's a bit dated. It dates from 2016. And it's actually derived from LinkedIn resumes, and it basically depicts where technical writers say they have DITA or DocBook or SGML or S1000D, all forms of structured content, and have used or are using Agile. As I say, this is from 2016, as a type of search routines that made this chart possible are sadly no longer feasible in LinkedIn. So there could be a change, but as you can see, DITA far and away is the most popular in terms of users who are using DITA within an Agile framework. The research that based on LinkedIn technical writer profile descriptions, has shown that just over half of all technical writers there who claim experience with DITA have experience with Agile, a significantly higher percentage than those claiming experience with any other XML standard. So clearly, many people who are using DITA are doing so in an Agile environment and have come from a place where Agile processes were used. So this is, again, bolstering my overall argument that if you're using Agile, you're more likely to be using DITA and vice versa. Okay, so now let's have a look at, some of the more nitty-gritty reasons why DITA works so well with Agile. So really, this is a key thing, Agile and content reuse in DITA. The content reuse idea of write once, use many has significant benefits, particular not just to the writers, but also to the business process as a whole. There's no need to rewrite what already exists, even if something has been tossed away in one sprint. Hey, maybe it comes back in another sprint, and you can then reuse that later, or alter it to the new needs. The other great thing about this is that there's also more consistent content, and single sourcing is pretty much built in. And I love this quote from Stan Doherty about his own particular experiences with the DITA and content reuse in this context. And in the end, DITA's topic-based approach assists with incremental development, documentation development. One of the tenets of DITA is content reuse, encouraging technical writers to write once, use many. This also means that there's no need to rewrite what already exists. So a writer can simply reuse entire topics, paragraphs, or phrases used elsewhere thanks to reuse mechanisms within DITA. This enables writers to easily keep up with the rapid pace of development changes. And due to short deadlines and time constraints within Agile environments, it's more expedient for technical writers to reuse content where it exists, and DITA provides easy mechanisms for accomplishing this. Another thing is that topic reuse improves content consistency. This is an additional benefit of content reuse. And in a way, I like to say this, I mentioned this in other presentations, that content reuse is in some ways like DITA's superpower. It has so many benefits across different processes. While I don't mention it here, if you're doing things like, say, localization, if you've already translated a reusable topic from English to another language, you don't necessarily have to retranslate it to again, and that means real significant cost savings. But back to Agile, the idea of, say, shared key warehouses between maps where they hold document variables like, say, product names, model numbers, trademark terms, and so on. They can then easily be shared between maps, and that's ideally how you want to use them. Phrase and topic level reuse convey the same messaging to users, improving the overall perception of the brand. And content that has been reviewed by SMEs can already be flagged as such, within something like a CCMS, so that they don't have to be reviewed or perhaps reviewed to the same extent as before. So the various content reuse mechanisms within DITA, such as topic-based content, conrefs, and keys, contribute to greater consistency in documentation output generated within an Agile environment. In many business environments, if you have a topic and it has been reviewed and approved and perhaps flagged as such in a CCMS, and you want to reuse it elsewhere, it does not have to be sent out for review again, as it has already been done. Now, that depends on the circumstances. The exception here tends to be regulated environments where all content must be reviewed in context. But even here, content reuse speeds up the overall approvals process. Another thing is that Agile user stories map well to DITA task topics. Scrum-based Agile often calls upon user stories to help craft development, and often will take the form of various procedures that users will want to accomplish. And this fits really well with DITA's task topic type. So, and in particular, Scrum-based Agile often calls upon user stories to help craft development efforts. These often take the form of various procedures that users will want to accomplish. This format fits nicely with the DITA task topic type. And one common practice I found when interviewing Agile-based DITA tech writers was for them to encapsulate the concept as the context for a task instead of writing separate concept and task topics. I'll get to that in a second. In fact, right away. So yeah, a possible DITA and Agile best practice for writing tasks emerged from the interview. So instead of writing a concept to be followed by a task, encapsulate that concept as the context for the task instead. Depending on the scenario, describe expected outcomes for individual steps and the conclusion, and use concept topics to then instead link between tasks. And again, I think this does make a fair amount of sense, especially if you're looking at things like a typical user interface where you just want you want the information you need on how to do a process, but you might need just a bit of context to help you understand where you are within the system to accomplish the process that you want to do. Another thing worth mentioning is the idea of Agile epics and DITA audiences. So epics are a collection of related user stories that comprise the complete workflow for a type of user. And from a DITA standpoint, epics can be used to help refine conditional processing for an audience. User types may change during development. The agility and flexibility of DITA makes it possible to change quickly. And additionally, Agile epics are collections of related user stories that comprise the complete workflow for a type of user. So from a DITA standpoint, epics can be used to help refine audience-based conditional processing of content, or maps, or chapters if you like, within a book map when an epic story hierarchy already exists. Another key thing is that DITA best practices advocate focusing on the user. This follows from how user stories map to DITA task topics. This leads to an emphasis on core tasks, and the user does not have to wade through irrelevant content to them in order to get things done. So similarly, the other main topic types, DITA's concept, reference, and task and troubleshooting, and PCAS's additional process and principle are deliberately structured, boxes that should make a good technical writer think about what information the user needs. So the constant change and iterations of content over multiple releases forces a change in the typical writer's mindset from document everything to instead document only what the user needs. And again, the granular topic-based nature of DITA helps make this possible. And again, in just case you're wondering, PCAS's extension of DITA includes two additional topic types, process and principle, which we cover in our writer training courses. In a nutshell, a process topic demonstrates to the reader how things work, and a principle topic advises the reader about what they need to do or not do. Another cool thing is that in an agile process, tech writers become part of the feedback loop. So the tight integration of tech writers with development within the development team opens possibilities for early feedback on product development. And again, I've touched upon this before, but again, the tech writers are often the very first to really get their hands on with, say, a piece of software or product, and they then provide hopefully that feedback to the developers in a way that that can suggest improvements. So again, not you are basically not just writing for the end user, but you're also essentially advocating on behalf of the end user, and that is a really good thing to do from in terms of writing practice. The other cool thing is that, and anybody who knows anything about the presentations I've done over the years, is that I have spoken a lot about DITA metrics, and it should not come as a surprise that DITA topics can allow for good documentation project measurement. So DITA's topic-based approach makes it easy to measure content. So within the CCMS, it's also possible to track how done, the doneness, so to speak, of topics within a given map are. And non-structured docs are conversely much harder to track due to this level of granularity. So, for example, in a typical Scrum-based Agile environment, everyone involved in a project gathers together to discuss progress in regular meetings. Using a traditional non-structured based approach, all that can typically be reported is something like, say, the word count or the number of chapters completed since the last sprint. But if you're using DITA, it's possible to match development features to individual topics, making it easier to report in a more realistic manner on documentation progress. If a CCMS is being used, workflow status, including, like the workflow states like draft, in review, done, can also be measured and reported at the Scrum meeting. Also, the DITA best practice of minimalistic writing reduces waste. And according to John M. Carroll, who was part of the IBM documentation team back in the 90s, genuinely useful information for users consists of the following components. It's available when and where it's needed. It's easy to find. It's immediately useful, and it's concise and to the point. When done right, DITA content plus minimalist writing hits all of these points. And by the way, a shout out here to Jan Graat, whose slide deck on DITA for managers is actually a source for this slide. And these ideas are used with his permission. So credit where it's due. The separation of content from formatting, of course, also saves time. Time is spent writing rather than formatting, and the separation of content from formatting saves considerable time. So, thanks to this, technical writers can focus on creating content rather than just formatting. An informal survey I did now many years ago with a team of technical writers using then a popular desktop publishing software that they use to produce their documentation showed that roughly half of their time was actually spent writing was spent formatting the content. That time could then be used instead towards writing more agile content within a database environment. I've also seen some arguments that adding tags, in structured content, takes extra keystrokes. But the fact is that you don't have to change your tags once they're in place, whereas you'll likely have to do that with things like header content in a typical non-structured desktop publishing program. And again, feedback is part of Agile. Documentation feedback is a developer requirement under Agile. So using DITA, turnaround of topic-based review with SMEs is much reduced. SMEs can typically provide subject matter experts. I don't think I've defined that term. SMEs can then provide feedback in a more timely manner, and it's easier to review a few topics than a whole book. And then we come to the idea of the definition of done. And again, if you've done any sort of work in an agile environment, I'm sure you've run across this idea before. What is done? Well, it's done when it's done. And no. In an agile framework, it has a different definition. So from a practical perspective, in order to make documentation review work, it needs to be considered part of the definition of done for a project. That means that the tech writer or manager needs to be kind of fearless in things like, say, a Scrum meeting, and say when something is not, in fact, done from their perspective. And anecdotal evidence suggests that when SMEs are made accountable in this manner, they have not responded, they've not provided the necessary feedback to get the docs done, and then the tech docs manager or writer speaks up and says, hey, we're not done, and here are the reasons why. I mean, it's not necessarily casting fingers, but it's part of the accepted work process. That means that they're more likely to work with you in the future. And again, coming back to the idea of minimalism, only document what's necessary. So not only based on feedback from developers, but also from users. And again, this fits with minimalist writing principles and ditto with lean principles. When possible, track online usage from published docs and prioritize user-favored content. One interesting example is UI related content on how to style content is reduced and the user experience is improved by writer feedback, ensuring that the user interface is in fact more usable. And this is one of my own little hobby horses. Short descriptions help direct users to content. So writing short descriptions for DITA topics is already considered a best practice, arguably more so for Agile-based content, as it provides a means of progressive disclosure as to the relevancy of content to users. This can be similar in intent to a user story where user X can do Y based on Z. And the example you see here is from Ixiosoft's online DITA CCMS documentation. You can see how the short description acts as a summary of the information it contains, providing information to the reader as to whether a given topic has the information they are in fact looking for. And DITA was also built with multi-channel publishing in mind. So the DITA OT, um, you know, uh, from the start, that this was one of the key ideas behind it. So prior to using DITA at IBM, multiple processes and tools were needed to create documentation in more than one format. DITA plus DITA OT, the DITA Open Toolkit, was the solution that they came up with. This reduces wasted time and resources that would otherwise be spent on using additional tools. And the cool thing is that it's possible to flexibly produce documentation at, say, the chapter or individual topic level on demand. Waiting for documentation deliverables is rarely a bottleneck in a DITA-based process. And looking at the most recent version of DITA, DITA 1.3, and the troubleshooting topic that was introduced, it's designed to provide specific solutions to scenarios that are likely to arise and how to then solve them. This, I think, has been welcomed by Agile writers who are looking for a troubleshooting option for user stories and where a task may not be an appropriate solution. Now, this can be countered by saying that a good Agile software development process should not require troubleshooting. I believe, however, that there will always be circumstances where troubleshooting is going to be necessary. And keep in mind that there are going to be some post-launch scenarios that will arise that simply were not thought of while creating user stories in the original development process. So in this way, troubleshooting topics can help. I don't want to say make it a band-aid solution, but essentially can cover over places where there would otherwise be a significant gap in documentation. Now, it's worth pointing out that Agile is not a panacea. It will not cure all ills, either for software development or documentation processes. And one of the two problems I kept running across in the interviews that I've been doing over the years is the idea of seemingly that documentation happens by magic. Well, no, of course you and I know that that's not the case. And Agile will not inherently solve understaffed tech doc teams. The typical symptoms is that writers can't attend stand-up meetings due to scheduling conflicts. So there might be more than one stand-up meeting they're supposed to attend, but they can't because, well, they're already attending another one. Writers perennially are falling behind on assigned topics to write, and a good Agile process manager will recognize this type of problem and either throttle back the work or then bolster the efforts for new hires. One of the interviews I did, there was a tech docs team that started to do Agile along with its development teams, but found it simply couldn't cope due to a combination of poor scheduling. Basically, writers couldn't always be there for the all-important Scrum meetings, and they were arguably understaffed. So in the end, the tech doc team reverted to waterfall style management. In other words, give us a program when it's done, and then we'll document it, which was the only way they could really cope. A good Agile deployment will include documentation teams and other stakeholders outside of the development team and managers who will recognize this type of problem and, as I say, throttle back effort if things are not working out. Also, there's sometimes an unexpected need for documentation glue. So the other problem is sometimes there's a need to make documentation glue for publications, and this applies to cases where a full manual might be expected. Sometimes the focus on tasks and how a user will work with a program doesn't always provide enough of the high level introductory or conceptual material that might it may not be covered in a typical sprint. So there's then still the need to answer the why would you use this type of question. The solution is then to recognize this need up front and allow for it in the overall documentation plan. And I'm beginning to get short on my own time here, so I'm just going to say that there are some good examples about how DITA and Agile can be used. I'm not going to dwell upon these sites because I do want to make sure I leave time to get to the IID approach. But safe to say that there are good examples out there about how DITA and Agile can work together. And I love this. I love the picture on this slide. I have to pause briefly on this because I think we've all felt that way at one point or another. Always wanted to do something to your computer, and not necessarily Valentine it. All right. So to sum things up, these are some of the ideas why DITA and Agile really can be a great partnership. So the topic-based approach on the left really works with Agile in terms of incremental development. You can update topics as required, and they're self-contained. In terms of task topics we have in DITA, they match well to Agile user stories, and the content is focused squarely on what the user needs to do. Individual topics can be counted, and in a CCMS, workflow can be measured. This, again, in Agile, fits the need to track development progress, and it's easy then to demonstrate progress. The best practice of minimalism in DITA writing goes along with the Agile idea of document only what needs to be documented. Keep it straight and simple, the KISS principle, and keep it light, kill, which also reduces waste. It also, reuse also improves content consistency, which provides continuous feedback from developers and users, and iterative publication to multiple formats on demand, means that there's no holdup for incremental product releases. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the iterative and incremental development methodology. So there are some issues that are particular to tech doc groups. There may be a need for methodology more obviously built around deadlines. There may be a need for earlier and more frequent deliveries and user feedback loops so that requirements can be refined sooner rather than later. They may also need a plan that allows for flexibility to absorb changing requirements while still driving towards a larger set of goals and deliveries. The key thing I find is that there's a need for flexibility while also retaining a structured process. So what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides is another approach to the problem of tech doc groups have been working within an agile framework to better fit the reality of deadline motivated and deliverable driven products. It's not focused exclusively on tech docs, but I'm hoping you'll see how this approach might prove a better way to working with agile processes. I should also add that precision content does do software development, which of course means we need to document them. Our relative success in implementing this methodology is why I'm bringing these ideas to you today. So keep in mind also that I'm not saying that you should necessarily dispense with all other forms of Agile in your doc efforts, just that this is another option to consider if you're running into the types of problems mentioned on this slide. So here we have iterative and incremental development. One of the definitions from Wikipedia, the basic idea behind this method is to develop a system through repeated cycles, which are iterative, and in smaller portions at a time, which are incremental, allowing teams to learn from development of earlier parts or versions of the system and via user feedback. From Techopedia, iterative and incremental development is a method that is modeled around a gradual increase in feature additions and a cyclical release and upgrade pattern. And by the way, for this section, I really had to kudos to Vivian Ashwandan, again, of Precision Content, for being the person who initially pulled this material together and also gave me some ideas on how to approach this topic. So where does Agile fit in this particular case? Well, Scrum methods and Agile values and principles are both incremental and iterative in approach. They are iterative because the work of one iteration is improved upon in subsequent iterations, and incremental because completed work is delivered throughout a project. Trends over the past few years show that Agile teams thrive when using both. And Precision Content has started using IID in our development and documentation processes. Now, as you'll note here and in following slides, this approach does not apply exclusively to documentation, but the idea is that this type of cadence would also work well for documentation development. So here is the planning cadence for IID. And basically, a project starts with what's known as a road mapping exercise. And in the initial meeting for this, the project leaders prioritize and sequence the work that has to be done, with the expected outcome that a project roadmap that comes with milestones and portion deliveries per increment. And the roadmap then guides us into the iteration planning meetings. In the iteration planning meetings, we identify a minimum viable product, which is a portion of the full increment goal, which then involves all aspects of that increment and then can be handed to the client for review and for feedback. Before the end of that iteration, we deliver a minimum viable product, which includes, which is the product feature and associated docs. The next iteration planning meeting pulls in previous feedback and any lessons learned and identifies the next small MVP we deliver, and that progresses us towards the larger increment goal. So once the increment's completed, we're left with a finished something that we don't revisit or reopen further down in the project. Our first milestone will have been met. The same approach is then followed for subsequent iterations and increments. If you're wondering what an increment is, well, in each increment, a slice or chunk of completed software and documentation is delivered through cross-team multidisciplinary work. We then build and deliver in incremental pieces until the whole project is complete. Each increment is divided into one or more iterations, each of which solicit user feedback and build on what's been learned from previous iterations. Each increment is a subset of the functionality, which contribute with contributions from all departments, and the deliverable at the end is then fully tested. And that means the feature, the software, and the associated docs. By the end of an increment, several rounds of user feedback and adjustments have been completed at the end of each iteration that falls underneath it. Therefore, the delivered subset of documentation at the end of an increment should be deemed to be complete and not require later revision. Now, that is the fervent hope. That's not always necessarily the case when it comes to docs, but that is true more often than not. Is our finding. What is in an iteration that falls below the value of an increment? Well, they're time boxed and are similar to a typical sprint, but are more usually longer. Iterations can vary in length, but commonly fall between 3 to 8 weeks in length, and iteration lengths don't have to be equal. Iteration 1 can be 3 weeks, iteration 2 can be 5 weeks. That depends on what is being worked on, and things can then be scoped accordingly. The full team contributes to each iteration delivery, and other teams do not wait until a later iteration to make their own contribution. Each iteration contains the same line items, in other words, departmental buckets of work that run through the entire project, such as transformation, conversion, modeling, publishing, what have you. Tasks will vary accordingly to the group and whatever the project's being worked on. And then a set of documentation is then delivered at each of these iterations. Progress is then made through successive refinements. So for example, during a first iteration, for example, HTML pages, the docs, are coded to support only a very simple type of search. And then, with the idea that this is sort of emphasizing perhaps something like a search feature. During the second iteration, additional metadata is then added. And then during the third iteration, search is then tested against the content and metadata and then refined. If iterations can't be met, then reduce the scope. Don't move the iteration end date. By the original planned iteration end date, a partial system should be in a stable and tested state. Consider team capacity when planning the scope of the iteration, team size, availability, velocity, and provided efforts. Typically, each iteration plans to meet a set of specific objectives and addresses a group of project risks. Tasks are then completed within the iteration to meet the iteration goals. And the iteration plan information should be compiled into a simple document. The first section of the plan should reflect the scope and objectives of the iteration. The primary goal of this scope is to make clear the iteration's objectives, priority, and evaluation criteria. So in this way, this sort of meets the goal for providing an overarching idea as to how things are supposed to work for, say, software development. But in this case, the writers, have more to latch onto in terms of how things are supposed to work and what they are to work on in a particular time frame. So here we have a typical IID flow, where in the first iteration, we design, build, and test the tiniest bit of what we have in mind for a product, and then we show it and get feedback from all stakeholders. In the second iteration, if what we created was well received, we then keep it and expand upon it for the next iteration. If what you gets then the thumbs down, you then discard it and then start again on this iteration. You then, in the next iteration, continue to design, build, test, and expand over successive iterations until the increment goal is achieved. Now, keep in mind that the overall goal here is to have a process that better fits the reality of deadline-motivated and deliverable-driven projects. That applies equally to software development and to its associated documentation deliverables. This planning method still embraces the typical Agile values and principles we know and love, but is more structured and proven to deliver more predictable results. And I'm almost at the conclusion here, just to let you know. So iterative and incremental development is ultimately built around achievable milestones. It better engages with internal resources at every step of the way, provides earlier and more frequent deliveries, giving the development team and tech docs more opportunities to give user feedback, perform user testing, and accept delivered functionality. And it remains flexible and can absorb change requirements while still driving towards a larger set of goals and deliveries. So we at Precision Content have been using Agile development processes for years, and we have only recently switched over to this IID approach. I hope that in a future webinar, I'll have the opportunity to do a deeper dive into how all of this has worked in practice. Though this process already appears to be providing dividends in terms of better products that are delivered on time, that include the appropriate level of documentation for their features. And at that point, yes, I am done. I do recommend that for further reading on this subject, please take a look at Vivian Ashwandan's blog post, which is available on the Precision Content website at the following address. And yes, I realize I've gone over well, no, I guess I have been speaking for roughly an hour after the intro, but yeah, and for those who are still with me, thank you very much, and I'm definitely open to hearing what you have to ask.
Thanks, Keith. That was a lot to take in.
I know. Like, I know.
Oh my God.
Not a small subject.
Yeah, and if folks are still on the line, we are recording this. If you have to drop off, yes, when we give you a link to the recording, you'll get Keith's email address, and you can send him follow-up questions. So just so you know. And also I wanted to let people know additional resources. In a couple of years ago, CIDM did a survey of their CIDM members about how they're using Agile. And CIDM members can download that presentation from the CIDM website. And there's also a webinar that Dawn did on related to that that you can pull too. So it's additional resource. But one of the things I wanted to point out before we get into the questions is we asked people, now most, not all of our CIDM members are using DITA, so we can't put that correlation to it. But what was interesting is we asked people why they were moving to an Agile practice, and only a small percent said they were doing it to increase quality, but that's why they were moving to it. But once they moved to it, 60% had a positive impact on their quality because of Agile. There's lots of statistics like that, but that one I thought was a really good one to throw out there. And then the other one I wanted to throw out there was, unfortunately, 20% of the people said that their writers, an individual writer, is supporting up to 5 Agile teams. Which is, gets into that whole problem that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Which that's quite high, which I thought, that's a shame. So with that, just to remind people that if you're a CIDM member, you can grab that report on the CIDM website under resources, research studies. Okay, let's get into a couple of questions. One of them had to do with the idea of often with waterfall, or not waterfall, with Agile, you are having to wait to the last minute for engineering to finish up all their work. And then lo and behold, how do you get that documentation done to still fit in the sprint? Do you delay your sprint, or do you hold up the sprint? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a real can of worms, isn't it? Because you don't want to, like Tech Docs never wants to be the one that's considered to be holding back the process, so to speak, despite the fact that they may not have been given enough to work with up front. I would say that there's no easy solution to that. If you run into it, I'd say the best thing to do is really, it would be more on the prevention side. You really don't want that sort of thing to happen. And that ideally you want to make sure that you meet with whoever the program manager, or say a scrum master, or whoever is managing the overall process is to let them know if you're not getting what you need to do the docs, in order to deliver on time. It should not be a surprise to anyone if in fact the docs can't be done because the writers have not been given enough material to work with. So one of the, and this has nothing to do with Agile, but one of the sort of dictums of being being a good technical writer, or even someone who is not a manager, is never surprise management. You always want to be communicating as to where you are in the process, and if in fact you do find yourself in that situation, and I've been in that exact same situation myself, is the best thing you can do is to communicate before, during, and after that you are in fact having these issues, so that again it's not going to be a surprise, and people are not going to say well, Docs is holding things up. It's like, no, Docs is not holding things up because Docs has not been given access in time to do the work that we need to do. So as I say, the best solution to that is prevention, and the best way to prevent that is constant communication, and a good Agile-based process really does should bring that to the fore.
So does the IID process help in that situation, or it's similar?
Yes, I would say so, because if anything, it ensures that there's more consistent communication in the process. That is certainly one of the ideas behind it, at any rate, and because of the more incremental nature of it, like and the more tightly bound scope on things. If the development is done and there's no associated docs, again, there's that'll be known arguably at an earlier stage in the process. So instead of finding this out at say the next Scrum meeting 2 weeks from now, it'll be reported within an IID framework, perhaps like maybe a week earlier or something, or maybe even on a daily basis, that you can report on your progress. So the more communication, the more feedback that we find that the IID process has given us some definite benefits in that regard.
Great. Let's see what else. Oh, I also wanted to say, in our survey, we did run a couple of teams that were running a sprint behind their software development team.
Yeah.
And
that's
that works for them, but it doesn't work for everybody. And then we also had some teams that tech docs had their own sprints separate from. So there's lots of different ways you can do it. And one person asked, what is the right ratio of writers to sprint teams?
Oh boy, I honestly,
and I don't know that there is an answer.
There is no answer. 5. There you go. Yeah, no, that's the answer. No, that's it. No. I mean, like, there is no answer for that. No straight answer, because it depends entirely on writer load and the tools they have, and how proficient they are in them, and also with the standard. And no, I mean, there's no easy answer to that. Or as I said, 5. There you go. Just take 5 and run with it if you like. But
Yep.
but I would say that otherwise, no, there's no straightforward answer, and there can't be.
Okay. Let's see, a couple more questions. There's people are going both in the chat and the questions. If you can just use the questions, that helps me, so I don't have to go back and forth, you guys. So, okay. So Frank wants to know, can you somehow quantify the productivity of IID compared to Agile?
Short answer is yes. The longer answer is I can't do that at the moment because we haven't been using this process long enough for me to deliver metrics, at least meaningful ones. So again, where I was saying that I hope to be able to deliver more information on this in the future, that's kind of where that would come into play. I would certainly hope to provide some sort of metrics to say that is the case. Anecdotally, it definitely seems to have made a difference, and the development teams and the associated doc teams seem to be hitting their milestones more frequently than under the previous method that they were using, which was more Scrum focused than before. So do I have metrics to report at this stage? No, but hopefully in the future.
Okay. Raphael is asking that he finds it difficult to imagine developers buying into the definition of done that includes finished documentation. But before you answer, I happened to pull up our survey, and 58% of the respondents said yes, documentation tasks must be completed before a story is accepted as being done. So if it's part of the story, then people are saying that it has to. So what's your
part of the
thoughts on that?
definition of done, then yeah, it has to be done. It depends on how firmly, I guess, the Scrum Master or those in charge of the process, enforce those ideas. I mean, yes, they are fundamental to how Agile is put into practice. As to how diligently that is handled, that depends on the individual person who is managing the process. I would say that yes, the definition of done, must by definition include docs. I mean, if you want to talk to whoever you're having an issue with and saying, Keith said that docs are part of the definition of done, and hopefully they don't say Keith who, but take it from me, they really should be considered part of the definition of done. And if they're not, then there is, I think, a fundamental disconnect between the docs team and, say, development in that circumstances. And that's a whole other kettle of worms. And that just says that the process is not working as designed.
Yeah, and unfortunately, 24% said that documentation tasks are not included in the larger development story, which is kind of a shame.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
All right, so then we have a question about, let's see. Oh, I just lost it. Where did it go? Oh, so when a tech team, writing team is struggling to keep up with their product teams, how do you identify if the issue is a bandwidth issue or an issue with the team's processes, such as their content delivery methodologies?
Oh, that's a good one. I almost want to say that it depends entirely on circumstances, and like if you don't know the difference, then maybe you're the problem. But I don't think that's really a sensible answer in this particular case. I think if there are bandwidth issues within a team, they are manifest at things like, say, weekly stand-up meetings. Now, maybe you're not doing that sort of thing, but that says to me maybe there should be more communication going on in that case, because that's telling me that if bandwidth is being stretched, that someone whoever is managing the process is probably not aware of it, and as we've seen with the previous question, maybe they don't care that much. They should be made to care. They should be made aware of this, because that is frankly part of their job. And if there is a need to throttle back because of documentation, then yes, I would say, like that is where that should happen. Now, I'm not a product manager, and if you look at the Agile manifesto, the idea of having workable software and delivering workable software will take priority over complete documentation. That is part of what the manifesto says. But having said that, there's got to be something there. Otherwise, the end users will be dissatisfied with the end result. So, to some extent, there can be a trade-off between incomplete docs but ultimately it impinges on the user satisfaction with the product. And deadlines are one thing, but many software returns and many more calls to, say, product support are the kind of inevitable result of when doc teams are not allowed to work to their utmost and to be able to do what they can in the time frame they have. So again, I put this issue pretty much squarely on the person who is managing the Agile process. And and again, it comes back to good communications and how much they hopefully care about the final deliverable being a good thing that people will be the end users will in fact be happy with, and not call tech support multiple times.
Right. But there's also that idea of what is the minimal viable documentation
Correct.
that you need
Yes.
to
Yes,
deliver.
exactly. Yes. Yeah. And
What's good enough, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, and I would say that in that scenario, you might want to do what I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and that is like focusing maybe on task-based information, and using and adding context as opposed to concept topics. Perhaps if there is then more time, expanding the context into separate concept topics, perhaps at a later point. But as I said, teams within Agile I found were typically writing task topics with context in them and excluding the concept topics, because that was in some cases all they had time for. But it worked. So it's again, that's one way you might want to think about of essentially helping to reduce the overall writer workload.
Yep. Okay, it looks like we have two more questions right now. Of course, more will come in once I say that, but let's do these. Have you ever seen or worked with groups that are releasing code every 2 weeks? And then they go on to elaborate their situation because they want to know how do these teams deliver content. They currently have a few Scrum teams on a fast train that releases code every 2 weeks, while the majority of other teams release code every 8 weeks.
8 weeks.
The
Wow.
tech writers are currently delivering documentation every 8 weeks, with the majority of the released code and retroactively including documentation for the fast trains. Is there a better way to do this? We
Wow.
also limited by time it takes to translate documents, published to the UI, and only having 1 day per week when we're actually allowed to publish content. So it's an interesting scenario she's in, but I
Wow.
think
Yeah,
the
that's
previous
really something.
answer, you talked a little bit about some of the things you could do.
Yeah. I mean, some things I've already talked about, I think could help help with that situation. It's interesting when I like the first thing I think about is like kind of the early days of, say, Facebook, when they were releasing changes pretty much on like a 2-week cadence. And it confused the heck out of users who were, where there was a change to the UI happening on, to them almost on a daily basis, it seemed. And of course, documentation. What documentation? There was no time to do documentation. Things were just implemented before they could be fully tested. I really hope that the 2-week cadence is in fact, fully tested before it goes out the door in terms of usability and so forth. Because I would expect in something that's going with that fast a cadence and releasing presumably to customers in that same time frame, that there would be a lot of things that would be like things are always changing in an agile environment, but that can be kind of like a crazy amount of change if in fact things are being fixed as in fact like they're also creating new features at the same time. So the first thing I is that I'm a little bit concerned that might be maybe a too fast a process in general, rather to deliver a good quality product. And this is based on my own experiences. I'm thinking of Facebook, but also I can think of one other firm whose name I can't mention that honestly had the same type of problem. They were releasing so quickly that they couldn't catch usability issues with their products, because by the time they'd release something, it had not been thoroughly tested. The first pass tests that could be done by the tech writers, there was no time for that. So things got missed, and the product did not develop in an as smooth a path as it could have otherwise have gone if in fact they had doubled, say, the length of the cadence at a start. And sure enough, that is pretty much what they ended up doing. The short cadence was just too short to be usable and workable, both from internal processes and also in terms of the demand of the end users, who were essentially working with a sort of perennially buggy product. Now, having said that, if that is the way things are and will always continue, then some of the ideas I suggested in terms of taking some sort of writing shortcuts are probably all you can really do in that particular instance. Yeah, that's about all I can really say about that.
Okay. All right, this last question, and then I've got to repeat some comments that came up too. But the last question is: do you need to have an established DITA system before you implement an agile approach?
The answer is no, but things almost always work a lot more smoothly if they do. The One of the things that a proper CCMS would like, okay, the two basic scenarios. You have, say, an XML editor, and you have a bunch of, say, file folders. Maybe you have a Git or GitHub installation for holding your content, and then you have, say, a CCMS. One of the advantages that the CCMS will have over the former scenario is a much easier way to be able to find XML content for reuse, which in turn helps with the agile process. It's like, I know I wrote something about that, 2 or 3 sprints ago. And here it is, as opposed to spending a lot longer doing that exact same process using, say, an XML editor and Git, just because Git is, usually not optimized for it's inherently not optimized to find XML content for things like reuse. Having said that, you can also use metadata. You can also use things like subject scheme to help properly classify content. Now, that's assuming you have enough time to include that in your sprint processes. Quite often that may not in fact be the case. But yes, I would say the key thing here is that a CCMS can help in finding the content you need for reuse. That's really one of the key things that in which in the ways that it helps. Also with collaboration between users, because you may not know that in fact someone else has already written the exact same topic that you need for your current sprint, and lo and behold, there it exists in the CCMS. Whereas again, it would be much harder to find that content if you were not using a CCMS in the first place. So, and that's only just a couple of reuse being one of the key things that a CCMS can really help with. There are other things, such as in other tools, like if you can include something like an acrolinks or a congree to help with standardizing the style and tone and voice of the documentation, again, across the board, across all of the writers. That can again make it easier for documentation to appear as if it's coming through with a single voice and a single intent.
Okay, quite a few comments about great webinar, worth staying to the end, etc. And just as always, when I thought we were going to wrap up, there is another question that came in, and it's not quite totally related, but it's an interesting topic. And it's all about, are there some best practices on how to conduct SME reviews in smaller chunks of content? It is sort of related to the whole agile processes, but I think that's a whole different discussion. I don't know if we
it dovetails nicely with what are the reasons for wanting to have a CCMS. And I would say that's one of them right there. Many modern CCMSs these days have a web-based interface and hide the code as much as possible, so that if you're doing things like SME reviews, again, you can do things at, say, the topic level, if that's what you want to focus on, and send that to a SME or a bunch of SMEs to review, and they just essentially get it as a web page, which they then either mark up or comment on or say approve or not approve, depending on whatever the circumstance is. It kind of depends on again, the level of granularity. Sometimes you might want to send a particular SME, something larger than just a topic, and often they may want that. But again, it depends on the circumstance. Again, I can think of more than one occasion where the SMEs want to focus on, it's like, you're not using the Oxford comma here. It's like, oh, it's like we don't use the Oxford, like focus on the problems that they should be focusing on,
they're not
rather
editors.
than yeah, exactly. So but on the whole, I would say, if and whenever possible, make it topic focused, topic based, opening up to things like, say, a chapter's worth of information, while perhaps providing more context. If a DITA topic is written as a standalone thing, that really should be enough, hopefully, for the SME to grasp and properly comment upon.
Yeah, and I agree with what you were saying, and the person, Roger, also goes on to say sometimes a given feature may touch multiple parts of the documentation, and so the SME has to see it all in context, right? So
yeah, in which case you just have to give them more information. But as they say, whenever possible, I think ideally you do want to focus at things at the topic level, but there are circumstances where you just have to provide more, because it may provide the necessary context for, perhaps for a set of procedures. It's not just one thing. You have to sort of put them all together for that one developer to really comment on properly.
All right, Keith, as always, thanks.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I think I see an article or two coming out of this IID approach at some point.
Quite possibly, yes. And there is, as I say, as you see here, there's already a really nice blog piece from Vivian. I much of what I've learned has really been from her on this approach, and she's the one who's implementing it. So I'm hoping, maybe in the future she might be the one who actually will talk about this more in depth.
Yeah, and then also your kind of wrap up slide, a very short article on just the, why did an Agile go together? Maybe just a short one on that one slide would be a great one too.
There you go. I have to work on my next convex presentation though too. So.
There you go. There you go. All right. I saw that Susan Jensen. Oops, I maybe shouldn't have said a name, but Suzanne, you look like you raised your hand. I'm not sure what that was about because I didn't see any other questions up. So I think she got it back down. So I think we're good. Okay. If you do have questions, like I said, we'll have Keith's email in our follow-ups to the link of the recording. And thank you, Keith. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And we hope to see you virtually in a few other webinars or at Convex.
Bye, folks. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.